All right, good morning. We got a light crowd today, but that's all right. I contemplated just having us like go to the diner or something, but we'll stick here. Um, yeah, we're in our series going through Holy Week. It's good to be back with you all. Um, Thank you, Brian, for serving the way you did last week, and of course the rest of the team here for allowing Laura and I the opportunity to get away with the other pastors and their wives in the Liberty Communion. You know, since Bryn was born almost 2 years ago, which is crazy, but that was the first time that Laura and I were really able to get away without her, so that's a big deal. Um, it was the first time you leave, like the first time you leave your children overnight is like, that's like a big deal, right? Right? And if you know me at all, I'm a bit of a homebody. Honestly, probably like my favorite place is my garage slash office. I'm also a workaholic. Somehow, like my hobby is just finding new ways to work. And Laura and others have been good at helping me try to like rebalance some of that. But yeah, all those things together made us ask the question before we went away last week, like, is it worth it? Going away was asking Laura's parents to take on my feral child for the weekend worth it, or was that too much to ask? Was asking so many of you to step up in the ways that you did and be responsible while we were away, was that too much? Was taking the weekend to be with these people instead of like reseeding my lawn or whatever else chores that I could have been doing at home, like was it worth it? Whatever the debate, the question that we kept asking leading up to this past weekend was, is it worth it? And I think in reflecting, like we all ask that question a lot. It comes up all the time to the point where now, like we look at cartons of eggs at the grocery store and we ask that question, like, is it worth it? Or we budget for a vacation and we look at our paychecks or our jobs and maybe some of the frustrations that are there. In all these areas of life, we're constantly asking that question, is it worth it? So we measure like returns on investment, ROIs. We place value on our time, our money, our relationships, often without even realizing that that's what we're doing. But we are. And I think every time we make a choice, whether it's a purchase, we add something to our calendars, whatever we do like that, we're placing value on where we spend our most precious resources. And I think when we step back and recognize that reality, we realize that how we spend our lives reveals what we value most and what we worship. Like in other words, what's precious to us is what we prioritize, and what we value most reveals what we worship. And I don't know about you, but when I step outside myself and I observe where I spend my time, money, emotional energy, sometimes I feel like there's a problem. Because there seems to be this chasm between what I most deeply care about and what my patterns and rhythms are communicating. So can anyone else relate to that discrepancy? Like feeling like things that I value and things I prioritize aren't lining up. That when I look at the way I've been living, I realize I've been worshiping the wrong things. And frankly, that sucks. And if that's the case, man, what am I supposed to do with that? Like that I want to value most, and then where I'm actually putting all my time, like I just can't seem to get those in alignment. Like how do I get those things back together the way I want? So if you've ever felt that tension, if you've ever wondered if what you're pouring yourselves into is really worth it, if it's what matters, listen, you're not alone. And I think this morning's text in Mark 14, verses 1 through 11, can really help us both evaluate our priorities and, more importantly, show us what really matters. And then more than that, it can show us how to get our investments in alignment with our values so that we can worship that which is truly worth our resources and our hearts. I'm just going to adjust a little bit because I'm learning my habits. I look this way. All right. So, yeah, like if If last week we looked at where we place our alliances and who we give authority, then this week I want us to look at like what we worship. I want us to look at where we put those resources that we have, the things that we say that we value most, if it lines up with our priorities. I want us to consider what or who we worship by what or who we value and how we express that practically. So to begin, I'm going to read again, beginning in Mark chapter 14, verse 1. It says, "It was now 2 days before the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and the chief priests and the scribes were seeking how to arrest him by stealth and kill him. For they said, 'Not during the feast, lest there be an uproar from the people.' And while he was at Bethany in the house of Simon the leper, as he was reclining at the table, a woman came with an alabaster flask of ointment of pure nard, very costly. And she broke the flask and poured it on his head. There were some who said to themselves indignantly, 'Why was the ointment wasted like that? For this ointment could have been sold for more than 300 denarii and given to the poor.' And they scolded her." So first, let's just kind of enter the scene. It's likely Wednesday that this evening is happening. Some think this account in Bethany is actually like a flashback to something that happened the Saturday before, and this story is kind of sandwiched between two others events on Wednesday. Ultimately, that doesn't matter. What is important is at the heart of all these leaders that Brian introduced us to last week were all united in contempt of Jesus, seeking to remove him quietly because they both feared the crowd and desired their affections and allegiances for themselves. And so this is the atmosphere that Jesus is in. And then he enters this home with people whom he should be able to trust and who recognize who he is. And so this is the narrative atmosphere that this new character, this woman, is introduced into to contrast this world that Jesus has been living in with then now this anointing that took place in Bethany. And here, beginning in verse 3, we find that the contrast comes in the form of this woman who interrupts this meal that's been happening. And she comes with this delicate, soft stone jar filled with precious perfume sourced from a flower found all the way and only in the Himalayas. I had to Google that this week. And this woman who goes unnamed here, John reveals in his gospel, it's Mary. It's the same woman who caused disruption before. There's like a trend with her when she sat at Jesus' feet while her sister worked. It's the same Mary who's disruptive here again as she breaks this jar and pours it on Jesus' head. And John again tells us that she takes her hair and she cleans Jesus' feet with it also. And church, like, picture this scene for a moment. Like, as you all are fully aware, I'm not Jesus. But imagine just that somebody came through these doors in the middle of the preaching here and caused an interruption, not that that would ever happen here, and just starts talking. And now imagine that she walks, or they walk right up to me and just like crack a container of cologne over my head. Like, listen, like a year's salary worth of this stuff. And if that's not enough, then she begins to wash my feet with the fragrance using her hair. Like, church, can we agree and acknowledge that, like, this is not normal? Yet this is what we find. And in response to this disruption and the smell that had to be overwhelming, the men around the table erupt in anger. How could this woman, culturally unwelcomed at this table, by the way, dare to interrupt Jesus? And what's wrong with her? How wasteful to take what was likely something passed down, that jar filled for generations, a family heirloom, and break it and spend it all in this one moment. Like, what gives her the right? Can we start to feel that tension? The question being asked below the surface here is that question, like, is it worth it? But more specifically, is he worth it? And the disciples and the others in the room around the table, they say no. They say it's wasteful. And honestly, like, it's hard not to agree sometimes. I mean, 300 denarii was literally a full year's salary, and I can't emphasize that enough. Like, listen, what's the most expensive thing you've ever bought or spent money on, just like dropped in one go? I thought about that for a moment. Many of you probably have heard the story because I like to talk, but when I bought my truck, that morning I actually sold my old one privately, and the guy literally handed me like a fat envelope full of cash. And then Laura and we drove to the dealership, and then I put all of that down on my current truck. The people at the dealership looked at me super suspicious. I assured them it was legitimate and that I was a pastor. They still reported me to the IRS. But that was like tens of thousands of dollars that I like earned and spent in one day. Still not a year's salary though. So if anyone here has ever spent that much money in one day, please come talk to me. I'd love to find out like how I can get in on that. But listen, like I spent a bunch of money on that truck. Holding that envelope though, like driving to the dealership, I had to ask, like, is this going to be worth it? And I determined in this case it was. Like, I used this truck for work. It's big enough to hold like the family, hopefully increasing in size one day. Like, and I work hard too. Like, don't I deserve it a little bit? And all these kinds of thoughts went through my head, and I don't regret the purchase. I don't think I should. But if I'm honest, that last reasoning is probably the one that was the strongest. Like, I believed that I was worth it. See, the money that I spent, what and who I spent it on reveals something about my priorities when looking at a vehicle and the value that I placed on myself in the process. And so jumping back into our text, that day in Bethany, Mary held probably the most valuable thing her and her family would ever own. And she didn't just take a portion and give it to Jesus. She went all in. She broke the flask, no going back, and poured it onto Jesus. And then she bent her knee and she bowed her head and she washed his feet with her hair. And she knew criticism would come. Like, just her presence in that room was taboo. But she went anyways, because as much as she may have worried about the whispers or the scorn of others, she was convinced that Jesus was worthy of it all. So church, in the story so far, like, who are you more likely to be? Because this is what gets to the heart of it. Like, what are we pouring ourselves into? Where are you spending or investing the resources you have? And are they worth it? Not just in our own eyes, but in the eyes of Jesus. And if not, what then? Like, what changes are you willing to make to align your priorities with your practices, your values with the things that you claim are worth it? And is Jesus part of that evaluation or not? See, Mary's values and priorities lined up. She makes this offering of everything she had, and the people call it wasteful, but Jesus says that it's beautiful. Mary says he's worthy. So listen to this response of Jesus. Jesus said, "Leave her alone. Why do you trouble her? She's done a beautiful thing to me. For you always have the poor with you, and whenever you want, you can do good to them. But you will not always have me. She's done what she could. She's anointed my body beforehand for burial. And truly I say to you, wherever the gospel is proclaimed in the whole world, what she's done will be told in memory of her." And then Judas Iscariot, who was one of the 12, went to the chief priests in order to betray him to them. And when they heard it, they were glad and promised to give him money, and he sought an opportunity to betray him. So Jesus says that this was beautiful. So let's just take a moment and talk about that, like the beauty of this broken flask. Because this wasn't a small act. This was everything. Mary broke open what was likely the most valuable possession her family would ever own. This jar of perfume worth a year's salary. And she shatters it. No portioning, no saving for later. All in, total surrender. And it's an act of worship that was impossible to go unnoticed. Not just because of the fragrance, but just like the tension in the room. And it's so easy, it's tempting to see this and agree with those around the table that this was wasteful, or that there's better things she could have done. That it was wasteful, but not to God when it's given to God. Because what or who could be more worthy than him? So this was an offering of all she had, her treasure, but also her dignity and her security poured out at the feet of Jesus. And that's what made it beautiful. Not the cost, but the heart behind the offering. This was an expression of love and gratitude. And in it she was placing the highest value she could on Jesus, because that's what true worship is. We say it every Sunday here. And when you consider that, like if worship is placing the highest value on something, like I don't know about you, but I have to ask myself, do I most often place that kind of value on God, or do I place it somewhere else? With my money, am I willing to drop it on the table for my truck, but not for the king or his kingdom? And that's where the contrast of this text can like hit us. Maybe even knock us down a peg, because while Mary is worshiping, people like Judas are watching. And the other Gospels reveal that he was the primary voice of criticism, John 12, 4 through 6. And he masks his concern for the poor, but his heart is somewhere else. Like we find out from the Gospels, he's a thief, and he's greedy. He doesn't see beauty, he sees waste, because this gift doesn't serve him. Judas was the one responsible for the money purse, and scriptures reveal that he was taking from them regularly. He was stealing from Jesus and his people, not investing in. And so in that we see where Mary responds to Jesus with gratitude, Judas responds with greed. Mary gives to Jesus, Judas tries to get from Jesus. And that's the same trust or take temptation that we've talked about all the way from the garden and on. Where Mary spends at the highest level, Judas sells Jesus for a slave's price, which just adds to the betrayal. Like 30 pieces of silver in Exodus chapter 21, Zechariah chapter 11, it's the price for a slave. And our king here is sold into slavery, ultimately to free us from it. And so, church, here's the question that hits me. Are we following Jesus to worship him or to work him over? Like, are we placing what we have into the kingdom's offering plates, or are we trying to pocket it for our own? And as we look at the posture of these two in contrast, like Mary's worship is open, it's public, it's bold. Judas's betrayal is secretive, calculated, reserved. One acts with reckless abandon. The other hides behind like this controlled appearance. Mary measures Jesus' worth by who he is, and he's worth her greatest possession. And in response, she seeks this proximity to him, knowing that he's worthy regardless of the cost. Meanwhile, Judas measures Jesus' worth by the values others might place on him and what he can sell him for. And he determines that he's worth no more than a slave. So just like wrapping that up, Mary pursues Jesus' pleasure and glory. She makes this offering to him because she sees him as worthy. Judas pursues self-preservation and reputation at the cost of Jesus. When we look at Mary, I think like this is what it means when we talk about gospel-motivated worship here, not just the words and songs we sing, but costly generosity motivated by Jesus' surrender and sacrifice first for us. Judas walked with Jesus, heard his teaching, seen his miracles, but in the end he still thought Jesus was just a means to an end instead of the destination himself. And I think a lot of people fall into that same mindset. But that's a false gospel and it's a lie. So as we think about that and how we look at Jesus in our day-to-day, in our practices, not what we say we value, but in where we actually place our priorities and then the rhythms and patterns for life that we're in, like whose model do we reflect most often? Whose world do we live in most of the time? Do we respond to Jesus like Mary or Judas? Are we breaking the fast, surrendering our treasure, worshiping Jesus openly and boldly regardless of who's watching, generosity motivated by gratitude to the King? Or are we calculating the cost, protecting ourselves, measuring everything by how it makes us look and what we might gain? When we consider this way, like this passage, it becomes a mirror. So take this moment and look closely, like who do you see? What heart is revealed in the ways that you respond to Jesus? Do you see a person of reckless generosity and gratitude towards the King? Or someone reserved, seeking to gain all that you can from him with as little investment as possible? And as you look in that mirror and you consider what you see, like also hear me, that if what you see in the mirror isn't what you had hoped for, like Jesus' grace will meet you there. He doesn't turn away from the broken worshipers. Instead, he receives, restores, and can make beautiful again. And so again, as you look, if you see a reflection you want to be restored and transformed, ask, like, what are you holding back from him? What have you measured or preserved instead of pouring out? What might Jesus call beautiful in your life if you broke it open for him today? Where are you reserved out of fear of man or withholding from God out of love of self? Where have you forgotten he's worthy and need to repent? Listen, the response to those questions is going to be different for all of us. Some of us hold on to our time too precious. Some of us waste it on worthless things. Some of us are holding on to our material possessions because despite our best efforts, we still place some of our value in them instead of him. Some of us keep trying to build up our own wealth, so we're stingy with generosity because we don't believe his promises that it's actually good and that he'll restore all that we offer. Some of us right now are protecting ourselves from forming new relationships out of fear because we've forgotten the healing and the rest that comes from being parts of God's family. In all of these, we ask ourselves, is it worth it? And some of us believe the lie. But when we hear the enemy speak that to us, man, like we have to allow God's voice to be louder and be reminded that what the world often calls waste, Jesus calls beautiful. And so then the question is, how do we respond in a way that Jesus would call beautiful? How do we align our priorities, where we spend our resources, with our values, what we care about, so that our practices become those acts of worship and worship towards that which is actually worthy? So to answer kind of that question, look with me back at what Jesus says in response to the criticism in verse 7 and 8. He says, "For you always have the poor with you, and whenever you want, you can do good to them, but you'll not always have them. She has done what she could. She's anointed my body beforehand for burial." You know, verse 7, you always have the poor with you. It's not like a throwaway line. He's not being flippant towards the poor. Actually, Jesus is quoting Deuteronomy 15:11, where God says there will never cease to be poor in the land. But then he goes on to say, "Therefore I command you, open wide your hand to your brother." Jesus is affirming that the opportunity and the responsibility to care for others is always before us. This is why we talk about local investment through tangible acts of mercy here all the time. Because God's mercy meets real needs. It's not theoretical. It's not charity from a distance. It's a posture of service that comes when we enter into close proximity with others in need. And he connects that care directly to worship. Like Matthew 25 verse 40 says, "Whatever you do for the least of these, you do for me." And I was listening to like a podcast or something this week, just scrolling through. I was in like a YouTube hole, so I couldn't find where I heard this week. But in one of those videos, I heard this said, and I need to hear it more often, that if you don't see Jesus in the poor, you don't see Jesus at all. So who here needs to hear that this morning, like me? Some of us, when we look in that mirror, need to find the areas where we're lacking in mercy and compassionate care for others. And then when we find it, we need to find ways to give of ourselves, because without it, our worship's actually incomplete. Some of us need to give to the local church, not because we need your money, not because it's a command, though I think in many ways it is, not because we want it, we do, but more than that, some of you need to give or give more because you need to practice giving out of gratitude in ways that are sacrificial and radical instead of stingy and reserved. Some of you give, but in your hearts you're holding back because you're putting more value on your kingdom instead of his. And so I'm not saying this to like guilt people or shame people into giving more here. I've talked to some of you individually, like I'm not a proponent of the like hardline 10% thing. I'm a proponent of generosity and whatever that looks like for you. And the reason that I'm suggesting an opportunity to practice this kind of giving here is because you need a place to do it. And for those who are giving, but you know as I talk right now that you're holding back and the way that you're giving is actually prioritizing something else first, like, hear me say this with love and not shame. But like that offering that comes not from your first fruits is the offering of Cain that God called unacceptable. So may we remember why Mary's acts was beautiful. It wasn't about the price or the extravagance. It was about the earnestness of her heart. Verse 8 She's done what she could. And so can we hear that and let that be like just such a freeing, grace-filled line this morning, that Jesus doesn't say she did everything that anyone could have done. He says she did what she could do. And that's what some of us need to hear today. That Jesus doesn't ask of us more than we have. He doesn't compare your worship to anyone else's. He sees the heart behind it. And when it's genuine and when it's given in faith and love, that's what makes it enough, and that's what makes it beautiful. And it reminded me of the widow in Mark chapter 12 with the 2 coins, like barely anything, but she gave all that she had, and Jesus called it more than all the rest. So again, it's not about quantity, it's about worship. It's about grateful generosity, not performance, not impressiveness, but intention. And we see this kind of life early in the church. Like this is right, Acts chapter 2. It says that the believers shared what they had, not because someone forced them, but because the gospel freed them to do it. They gave to anyone who had need, because in a family we're supposed to care for one another. That's what a gospel-motivated family is supposed to become. A people marked by mercy and community, motivated by the gospel good news that our God gave himself first, fully, and for us. And Mary understood that in ways that no one else could see at the time. Because verse 8 also said that she anointed Jesus for burial. So in light of that, let me ask you, what does it look like to do what you can today, this week, this month? What does it look like to live into that kind of beautiful waste? Generosity the world might call foolish, but Jesus calls faithful. And remember, faithful daily obedience in our patterns, in our rhythms, our practices themselves are the kinds of things that can become a fragrant worship if we allow them to follow the example that Jesus says flows out of a response to the life he modeled and gave for us. So for a moment, pause, let's breathe and consider, what might Jesus be asking you to break as a flask in your life? What are you holding on to as precious instead of pouring it out for the one who truly is worth it? If Mary's like any of us, the question we posed this morning, was it worth it? Probably went through her head as these men yelled at her and judged her. Or maybe it came the second the bottle broke and she had that gut punch realization that she'll never get that back. But I think her actions reveal to us that that lie that it wasn't worth it didn't linger for long. And by verse 9, it's pretty obvious that Jesus was affirming how worth it this moment of worship would be. Because here he says to this entire room that wherever the gospel is proclaimed in the whole world, what she's done will be told in memory of her. And so here we are, quite literally thousands of years later, doing just that. So yeah, worth it, I'd say. And then how miraculous is this? That out of everything Jesus could have tied to the retelling of his gospel, this is what he chose. Not a miracle, not a parable, not a teaching, but this moment that the world saw as wasteful, but he saw as worship. And as I meditated on that this week, I think the reason why is because of all the ways that her act would mirror his own. See, she poured out what was most precious to her, and in just a few days, Jesus would pour out what was most precious to him, his life. Her jar would be broken and poured out for him. His body would be broken and poured out for us. Her gift would fill the room with fragrance. His sacrifice would fill the world with his grace and his spirit. And in all this, what Mary teaches us and what Jesus reveals is that enacting what the world sees as reckless generosity is what Jesus sees as sacrificial stewardship. Which actually is the gospel message, that our King, with all authority and the greatest value, gives himself, pours himself out for his people. And so now he asks us to be generous and to give this way because he's done it first for us. And this is the kind of practice that communicates our commitment to value others the way that he's valued us, to love them as we love ourselves. And this communicates our deepest dependence and gratitude on God who gave himself for us. And so we worship him. So listen, contrary to anything different you may have heard, the gospel according to the scriptures is not that God died so that you could take his life to go to heaven. I actually think that's a gross interpretation. Instead, the good news is that there is a king with all authority and the greatest value who willingly poured himself out for his kingdom so that its citizens can experience freedom from every burden of guilt or shame, so that we can have the fullness of life that close proximity to his presence can offer, together adopted into his family forever. I actually think that's what makes the gospel good news. But to worship the King is to mirror the same kind of practice and pattern. What we find modeled by both Jesus and Mary is that true and beautiful worship is costly, it's countercultural, it's often criticized. But it's the fragrant response to those who have truly seen the worth of Jesus and his sacrifice, and that it leads to life and life with him. So church, what will you do with that definition of worship? What does it look like to pour yourself out? What might it mean to live a life that looks like waste to the world but smells like worship to Jesus? Where do you need to be a little more reckless or less reserved? Where do you need to break some flasks? Where do you need to be reminded that Jesus and his way is worth it? Let's pray.